Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. This is the first edition of the 2022-2023 season of the Misinformation Speaker Series, co-sponsored by Harvard University and the Shorenstein Center, as well as Northeastern University's new lab for text, maps, and networks. I'm Matt Baum, and I'm a faculty member at Harvard, and I'm also joined here by my co-host for the year, Brian E. Swire-Thompson from Northeastern. And today we have Heidi Larson speaking. Before I introduce Professor Larson, I just want to give you a little information on the remaining fall speakers of the series. So on November 2nd, we have Michelle Amazine, who will be speaking in person in the Malkin Penthouse at the Kennedy School. That's also at noon. All of these are Wednesdays at noon, I should say. On November 16th, we have Stefan Lewandowski, who's also going to be in person at the Malkin Penthouse at the Kennedy School. And then on November 30th, we have Jamie Druckman, who will be speaking virtually. So that will be another Zoom meeting. And then we will, of course, have a spring session as well that will be hosted by Northeastern, and we'll be sending information about that out down the road. But today, as I mentioned, we're very fortunate to have with us Professor Heidi Larson. She is a professor of anthropology, risk and decision science, and is the founding director of the Vaccine Confidence Project at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's also clinical professor of health metric sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle. She has served on the FDA's Medical Countermeasure Emergency Communication Expert Working Group, and is also principal investigator of the EU-funded project on the deployment, acceptance, and compliance of an Ebola vaccine trial in Sierra Leone. Dr. Larson's research focuses on the analysis of social and political factors that can affect uptake of health interventions and influence policies. Her particular interest is on risk and rumor management from clinical trials to delivery, as well as on building public trust. Today, she's going to speak to us on emotional contagion and the power of belief, why it matters to global health. Professor Larson, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much and happy to be here. Let me share my slides. Okay, can you see that?
Yes. Okay,
great. Okay, I can skip through the title slide. I'm going to just kick off by showing you, this is a book I published, or that came out literally on the eve of COVID, or it went to press, I should say, on the eve of COVID, was published in 2021. But I'm showing it to you because of the table of contents, because this book, which is largely about vaccine rumors, why they start, why they don't go away, and the key reasons are some of the points in the talk: perceptions of dignity and distrust, risk anxieties and perceptions, volatility of opinion, wildfires of emotion and misinformation, emotional contagion, the power of belief. And actually, I had written the last chapter on pandemics and publics, not knowing we were about to be launched into the COVID pandemic. So here we are. So I'll jump in now. Well, we've I look a lot at rumors, and sometimes they're rumors about specific things, but they're also about specific products, but they're also kind of existential rumors. COVID doesn't exist. We saw this a lot during Ebola, at the beginning of AIDS, and there's this kind of denialism that something exists when it's uncertain, it's fearful. You feel like something doesn't make sense here. COVID is a lie. COVID is a hoax. The degree of the impact is not significant. That's Bolsonaro about to throw off his mask, and we've seen similar things across the US. So this denialism is one aspect of rumors. So when I investigate rumors, like COVID is a lie, there are three key things that I look at, and I talk about this in the book. There is what I call the fertile ground factors. Why do people believe these things? How do they get traction? How do rumors get traction? What triggers them in the first place? How do they get traction? And then what are the impacts? Because we've seen that, you can have the same rumor, say about a vaccine or something else in 3 different geographical settings around the world. And in one country, they can shut down and disrupt a whole vaccination or other program. Whereas in another country, they just fizzle and die. So you need an appetite for rumors and to keep them spreading. So in the beginning, it was a lot of questioning and rumors about even the existence of this new virus. But these notions, and some of them, one of the other rumors was building on the COVID is a lie, COVID doesn't exist, it's a big plot of the pharmaceutical industry to sell a new product, because actually we really don't need the product. But this questioning around both the disease and the intervention in the case of the work I'm looking at is largely vaccination, although going broader these days. This is a very from the 1898. This notion that vaccination is a delusion. The other aspect is, okay, the disease exists. You've made a vaccine, but actually it doesn't work. The whole concept of putting the whole principle of vaccination working is in question. The notion of fake news is also not brand new. And part of the reason I'm showing these historic references is, a lot of people have contacted me and said, oh, why is all this starting now? And I said, well, actually, it's not starting now. It's certainly been amplified. And I think the COVID pandemic has certainly been fertile ground for the amplification of risk and rumor. But fake news has been here before. This is from, again, 1894. Even the term, Trump did not invent this one as much as he would have liked to. What was interesting to me and what I love is this, another thing that really is unthinkable now, just in terms of the usefulness. In the Second World War, there were a lot of rumors flying around about husbands, sons, and brothers who had gone to Europe to be in the war, Second World War. There were all kinds of rumors and anxieties about whether they were alive, what was going on, what were the state of things. So the Harvard group of people from the psychology department started a rumor clinic. And they would once a week, together with the Boston Herald, once a week, they would publish a frequently circulating rumor and debunking it. So anybody could send in a letter with a rumor during the week, and on Sunday they would pick one and debunk it. This was an era where actually, that could work. But in today's environment, the dynamics are incredibly different. The whole scale of the issues and the nature of contagion is quite different when it comes certainly to misinformation, rumors, and emotions. Whoops. So in 2018, there was a lot of, even before then, a lot of discussions, particularly after the H1N1 pandemic that didn't turn out to be as big as was feared. There was a whole wave of panels and think tanks on, are we ready for the next big one when it comes? And Nature asked me to write a piece on the information misinformation and in general, and I thought we're going to have a viral misinformation nightmare, which we have, but it is not unique to the pandemic. It's just, as I said, amplified it. I work a lot. I'm unusual in anthropology because I work a lot with big data, but looking at kind of the dynamics of kind of crowd swarms and how people think, and this is where the contagion part comes in. This is a big analysis of Facebook groups, and the blue dots, blobs, whatever, are positive, vaccine positive groups, and the red dots are the kind of critical against vaccines, and the green dots are the I'm not sure, I'm out looking for information. And although the number of individuals in the various blue groups are significantly more, it's almost 7 million individuals, and the red groups are about 4 million. They have broken into, the red groups have broken into over 300 small communities, being much more responsive, much more listening to the different concerns in the undecided group, and recruiting people at 500% faster than the pro groups. So this is moving at a speed that is much bigger than any individual rumor clinic or the current public health communication is even on the edge of catching up with. We need a much more systems approach in my mind. I talk a lot about rumors, but to me, vaccines have been a window on a whole world of stories, rumors, histories. One of the things I've seen is that sometimes rumors are really not about a piece of misinformation. There are emotions that are driving anger, beliefs. It's about other things underneath. It's almost like it's not the piece of information that's the problem, or the challenge. They're believing it. Sometimes I say misinformation is a symptom, not the problem, and a symptom of some deeper issues. And there is in the world today, and I know it's not the first time in history, a lot of anger, a lot of protest. This is in Belgium. This is in the UK, which often prides itself on having good vaccinators and being compliant. Actually, this is the health workers during the midst of the COVID pandemic. They went down to Trafalgar Square and spread their uniforms across the square, demonstrating against the requirements for them to have a COVID vaccine. What they were against actually was the mandate. Not all of them were against the vaccine, but they wanted to decide for themselves. This is our friend Robert Kennedy Jr., who's not just driving a lot of questioning about vaccine science in the US, but he's actually been doing some tours in the world and been very present in Europe. This was in Italy, and drawing not a small crowd. So the other piece of the emotional contagion and the spread of misinformation and emotion, I really think that there's been sometimes too much attention to the social media piece, which is a huge factor and certainly a significant amplifier, but we can't lose sight of the world that it lives in. This is a huge crowd. This is not a small thing. And I think we have to look at the ecosystem of the in-person, the online, the other types of media besides social media, other forms of media. In Africa, for instance, radio and TV are still significant influences on people's information source and belief. This is in France. It's also creating, on the one hand, fear of the vaccine, but also expressing underlying anxiety and fears. Why do I care about this? Well, I got into this in the first place because I was leading UNICEF's communication and strategies around the introduction of new vaccines around the world and launching the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. And I thought I was going to be mostly working on proactive strategies, making them culturally, socially, locally appropriate in different settings and, you know, clearly with our local teams on the ground. But I ended up doing more firefighting because we had an epidemic of individuals, sometimes people in government even, or groups questioning and vaccines. So I saw that this was in 2000, that between 2000 and 2005, and I felt like we needed to understand what was going on, because this was relative, the extent of it was concerning. And I left and came back to academia, set up the Vaccine Confidence Project, and we have been mapping around the world these dynamics, again, trying to take a bit more of a systems approach to looking at it. Now, one of the concerning things we saw, since we've been monitoring vaccine confidence, we developed a vaccine confidence index. So between 2015 and 2018, we looked at a number of questions, but just on the question vaccines are safe, we have seen quite a significant change in sentiment. When we did our first baseline global study on vaccine confidence, we identified Europe. I thought it would be the US, but Europe was the most skeptical region in the world, and France, more than any other country, had the highest rate of skepticism about vaccines. It was, I think, 42 or 43% of the people answer to the question, to the statement, vaccines are safe. 43% said they did not agree. That's a lot of people. So we've been watching the trends over time. We monitor every 2 years for the European Union. We just launched the 2022 report, but we also look at how things are changing. And sometimes things get better, but we saw that this in Africa between 2015 and 2018, this yellow area signals that there's a drop in confidence, that there's more questioning, more anxiety. And what we noticed about these the countries was that it was the French-speaking countries, so Francophone, looking more at the French media. And we've started to look in a number of things. Poland also has a strongly organized anti-vaccine movement. We all started to see that in some of the Polish communities in Scotland and the UK that started to get less and more and more hesitant around vaccines. We've seen in other countries that there is, because of the connectedness, people are going to some of their home countries online, in touch with their relatives, and there's this diaspora of emotion and belief that goes with the language diaspora. So that's the setting. But within that, one of the other concerning trends is that there's this growing, some say anti-science, certainly a questioning of science going on, which is also undermining their confidence in health interventions. A lot of it is related to fake news, but there is in general this much more questioning around science, public citizen questioning. Biden and other political leaders are starting to point to social media companies to say they need to do something. I personally don't think shutting it all down is going to be the sole solution, because this is about people's deep beliefs. This is about their anxieties. This is about their anger. So that is not going to go away by just shutting off the system, although that would certainly slow it down, the amplification. And this was not online. This was, I'm sure some of you have heard of Sherry Tenpenny, one of the various people who is amplifying some of the rumors, such as vaccines magnetizing you. And from the side of the healthcare professionals, because one thing we try to do in my group is, in whatever country we're trying to do an assessment in, we try to listen to all sides. And we have seen on the side of the healthcare professionals really an exhaustion sometimes, and really this lack of respect. And that's when I pointed to the chapter on dignity and respect, and distrust. That's one of the sentiments we're seeing. We're also seeing a rising aggression towards scientists. So this isn't just about misinformation and beliefs. There is it's impacting on vaccine acceptance of other health interventions, but it's also leading to aggression towards scientists, which we've seen in an unprecedented way in COVID. We have seen it around other issues before COVID, but somehow it took a whole different level in COVID. Sometimes in my book, I talk about in the Enlightenment, science was freedom from religious dogma. It was the great freedom. Universities here in Europe certainly were made independent of the religious institutions, scientifically based, to think for free thinking. But what we're hearing from publics around the world is they see science as the new dogma. Science says, therefore you do. And that came across in a big way in COVID. What was interesting is they were less attacking the politicians sometimes and more attacking the scientists who were informing the policies. They were angry about the policies and blamed it on the scientists. And sometimes the healthcare workers. This was in a community in Las Casas in Guatemala that really disrupted their COVID program. Previous to COVID, we had seen polio workers being killed. I think there were nearly 100 polio workers, even the security guards that were with them, but over 100 deaths in the last decade around the polio program. In Guinea, when there was an Ebola outbreak, one of the people coming into from the international, it was either MSF or another group that had come to help out, was killed, where they were killed by villagers because they were afraid, they didn't believe it. So the kind of aggression that's coming out is at new levels than we've seen certainly historically, and something that's concerning. It's come to such a level that both science and nature have done analyses on this, surveys, and nearly 60% talked about attacks on credibility, certainly the emotional and psychological distress. 15% talked about death threats, and nature had some similar reports. And what's additionally concerning is, in this environment, we need scientists to speak up, because if scientists go silent and the public is not believing it, we're not advancing science, and we're certainly not advancing the public understanding of science. But what's happened in this very increased, growingly aggressive environment, that a number of scientists are pulling back from speaking on the media, of being public about it, or certainly going online, because around some topics, it's become quite toxic, not for everything, but it has created a kind of withdrawal at a time where we really need something else. This was before he's was prime minister, so this is one of the various concerns. Rishi Sunak had talked about we shouldn't have empowered the scientists so much during the pandemic. The title is a bit misleading because he's not just dismissing science. What he's saying is that we needed to include other, consider the implications to bring in the health, education sector and other sectors. So that piece of it is certainly understandable, but the idea that you should not empower scientists during a pandemic is a worrying trend. While there is a threads of misinformation here, it's not all misinformation. Some of it is expressed as misinformation, but there's also, as I'm sure you know or have heard about in lectures, disinformation, purposefully plotted information to disrupt and divide. But there's also this issue of emotions. And anger is a big one. Anger and frustration with some pieces of hope here and there. There was a very good study in France that I thought was unusual. In the last couple of years, there's been kind of an epidemic of surveys about would you take a COVID vaccine? But these are colleagues of mine at basically at INSERM, so the French Institute of National Institute of Health, and they did a study asking people after they had been vaccinated, did you feel relief? I certainly was. Did you feel regret? I really shouldn't have done that. I did it because I had to, and then there's some people, did you feel resent? Were you angry? And it was really striking the number of people who were angry. And the article that this was published in talked about the fact that, even though people took the vaccine during COVID, it did not mean they were not hesitant. And that they took it because they had to take it. They took it because they wanted to go to that rock concert or that cafe or see a friend or whatever, but that actually it hardened their views towards vaccine. And it was like, I did this because I wanted to be able to do other things, but you can be sure you're not going to see me again at that clinic. My research group, we are looking now, spending the next 2 years doing a big study on what are people thinking and feeling to capture the emotions of people coming out of COVID. What were their experiences? What could have made it better? Who did they turn to? What supported them? What could have made their experience better to help inform from the people our future preparedness plans? So we just finished a whole series of focus groups and in-depth interviews in Sao Paulo, New York, Paris, Abuja, Bangkok, and Delhi. And we'll be doing a number more. And this was just from the Paris focus groups, the word cloud from the 3 days of multiple focus groups with different sectors. Controlled, frustrated, imprisoned, anxious, anxiety, irritated, obedient, attentive. I mean, it was sad, a whole mix of different emotions. We're just launching, by the way, with the Lancet, or actually we announced it before COVID and it was parked, but starting it again, a Lancet commission on the emotional determinants of health. It seems to have even more relevance now, but it will be an interesting commission to be working with, and look forward to that report. The World Economic Forum has also been tracking what people are feeling, both, I mean, from their concerns, some of its impact for markets, but also just in terms of engagement. And this was just from this year's risk report. It's not a pretty picture. 23% of the world are worried, 61% are concerned, 12% positive, with just under 4% optimistic. So at least there's some, but that's just a reflection of a global window. And that was in quite a number of countries. The issue of polarization is a big one too. When you're polarized, you're much more willing to believe rumors about the other side that you're against, or actually even plant rumors about the other side. Some of the disinformation research has also shown that those who are purposefully planting and undermining facts or issues are equally in the pro and the con, but that what they're trying to do is put people against each other. One of the concerning things that I've also seen is that how people express their are starting to express some of their resistance to vaccines, among other COVID interventions, has been this freedom mantra, but really almost abusing the notion of freedom, because my freedom to not take a vaccine is more important than your freedom to be free of disease. So you could get into quite an interesting dynamic, but it's been they've picked a term and an issue that is like, you can't take my God away from me. You can't take my freedom. Nobody can argue with freedom. So it's something that you can't go to Facebook and start deleting freedom. We won't be tackling the issue by only taking down pieces of non-facts. This notion of freedom has come out in a number of ways. It's organized people, it's contagious, it's movements. And that's, I think, a big shift in the whole misinformation space and all the anti-vaccine type of things. It's really moved from small groups of people to much broader mass movements organized around bigger issues. Even Andrew Wakefield, who published the article in 1998 suggesting that MMR vaccine was related to autism, and has really triggered global rumors about it, that the paper's been retracted, it's been debunked, but he's moved on to similarly this freedom of choice mantra, this freedom mantra, which makes them more untouchable. It's one thing to take down a piece of a study that was not ethical, neither ethical nor correct, but it's another thing when you move to talking about freedom. And this again is a big driver in France about liberty. But this one also was one that I just found really kind of an extreme expression of freedom to infect others. This was in Washington, D.C. And some of the narratives around it, it's about freedom, it's about government outreach. And this was one of the truck drivers that was blocking the border into Canada. Who would have ever thought that a group of truck drivers would care about vaccines? But he says he's making a trip for his 11 years old son. And this was a highly organized movement. I mean, they're online, you could get maps of where these different drivers were going and how, it was highly choreographed, highly organized. And some of it was spontaneous and some of it was organized, but it created this movement. Canada was feeling like, oh, this is way bigger than we expected. Is this a trend? Is this going to be something bigger? Is this a one-off? And I think the world should be asking this question. And I think we really need to think differently on on how we respond to these issues or manage. And in the Guatemala situation, I showed you an earlier picture of one of the disruptors, but one of the things when they were looking at why didn't they do well in their program, and they said, well, they should have connected with the indigenous communities earlier. And this connection with local has become a big, I think, when I think of where people ask me, where are the successes in COVID, they're hyper local, hyper engaged. We saw a similar thing when I was working on a 5-year project around engaging communities around Ebola vaccines, tracking rumors across Ghana. One of the things that the parliament was even calling for in Ghana in the context of a flurry of rumors about Ebola, this parliamentarian said a lot of people are confused. The youth are agitating, the feeling among the people, and the newspaper said, all these things are starting to happen around an Ebola trial without so much as a word to the Ghanaian public to prepare their minds for the trials. So this importance of engaging publics early, not when you've got something to deliver, has come again and again. They were involving taxi drivers, soldiers, all kinds of people. And similarly in the US and other countries, barbers, restaurant workers, a whole different cadre of people were getting involved locally with their local communities, known entities, religious leaders. This was in Bhutan. The US had sent a shipment of vaccines, but the Buddhist monk was blessing it before it was, and what that did was bring together the scientific and health regulations, but also the values. And that's what I think a lot of publics feel like, the science and the products have become so detached from values and society. Indonesia also, after approving their safety vaccines, they took it to the Islamic leaders and said, we need your blessing before we roll this out. We know it will matter to the people, and it certainly did. And one of my favorite campaigns, and last slide here, last couple slides here, was in Bolivia. They had their campaign was doses of hope, which I think is an incredibly positive lever of emotion and success. And again, like the question Canada was asking themselves, I think it's really time to not just rejig the way we did things before COVID, but really clear the slate and look at where we are today between science, between publics, with the health system. But I mean, there are many sectors that need to take this look. I happen to come from the health perspective, but it's system-wide. This is our website, the Vaccine Confidence Project, vaccineconfidence.org. We have a whole archive of stories and studies on this. But we're starting a new initiative that's related to the Vaccine Confidence Project, but is broader, and it's much more about societal cohesion. And the Paris focus group that I showed you, the word cloud, this was what we're calling the Global Listening Project, really to understand from people around the world these broader underlying ferment issues and how we can start addressing them in a different way. And we've run, as I mentioned, these different focus groups. We're just now going through fascinating stories and narratives, and then we will be expanding this to 65 countries. Thanks very much, and I hope I stayed in time to get you enough room for questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. We do have time for questions. Just a reminder, please use the Q&A box on the bottom of the Zoom screen and write your question. I see we've got some that have come in, so I'll just read them out to you, Professor Larson, and you can take it away. So our first question, your talk reminds me of the media's framing of Trump supporters as folks who are simply economically anxious. What are your thoughts about where these emotions come from? Do we all have them? Are we stuck in a cycle now that is leveraging these emotions to expand to other issues? What can we do?
Well, there's no quick fix, but I think we all have our emotions, that's for sure. And I think what's interesting, actually, one of the best books I've read on emotions, and she's one of our commissioners with the Lancet Commission, she's in Boston, Lisa Barrett. She wrote a book called How Emotions Are Made. And it's a fascinating book, and it really talks about our emotional system like our immune system. We're born with the system, but everybody's is different depending on what you're exposed to. And I think that important factor that your emotional being is very much related to what you're exposed to, what you go through. So people who are living or born in certain situations, or having been through trauma, or having been through different situations, are going to react differently. And we see that in the kinds of reactions there. Some of this emotions to a certain extent can be managed, but I think one of the things we've seen is you need to get there early and be responsive. But I think we also need to do a lot of listening. I see listening in itself as an intervention. Freud used to talk about the talking cure. I think we have a lot of people who have a lot of emotion, and if they can't have opportunities to feel like they're being heard, I think the situation's not going to get better. There's no quick fix, but I think we have to start somewhere. It's going to have an impact on climate. Similar things are happening in the climate science space.
Okay, next question. Well, I agree with vaccination and have been vaccinated. I have one question. Some people would be harmed if they take the vaccine. Do you know if there's a method of separating them from those who would be helped?
Say that again?
Some people would be harmed if they take the vaccine. Is there a method of separating them from those who would be helped?
Harmed.
That's what it says, yes.
Well,
reaction, I don't know.
Reaction.
Yeah.
There are rare risks with some vaccines. I mean, there's some of the more, if you're talking about side effects, which I don't know if you mean people who for underlying symptoms shouldn't take. I mean, for underlying conditions shouldn't take vaccines, like people with weak immune systems, or if you mean the risk of adverse events. But I don't think in either case, you don't need to separate them from, I don't see any reason to separate them from other people.
Well, they're generally identifiable in advance. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, that's the primary care physician's job, I guess.
Yeah, I would.
Okay. All right, next question. Happy questions. Depressing, but it could get worse. Is there evidence that anti-COVID vax attitudes are rubbing off on the childhood immunizations?
Absolutely. And I don't say that lightly because I just spent the morning giving a talk to the EU. We've found in our EU study and our Africa study, and we're just finishing a global 67 country study looking at, because we've been monitoring vaccine confidence, but more around childhood vaccines since 2015. We have some background data, and certainly since COVID, there's been a negative knock-on effect on background confidence more broadly. How this affects uptake, we'll see. This might be just a hangover from, some of the anxieties and concerns and some anger about, all the constraints of COVID. We're going to watch this carefully, but I think it's an issue. It's not just an access issue. We do have a lot of catching up just because during COVID, a lot of people either couldn't get to the vaccines, but some of that work will be published soon. Some will be published a bit later. But yes, it is something we have extra work to do on now.
Okay, next question. Is there any evidence that any technique used to fight mis or disinformation that you've been discussing is effective, basically? So do we have evidence on efficacy of the methods of responding to this problem?
I think the short answer is there's no one fix. We certainly want to reduce, there are a lot of fact checkers out there now. A lot of these companies have, teams of fact checkers. And so that's certainly helpful, but it's not going to solve the problem of a lot of some of the emotions behind it that are so I think that some of what we have to look at is trying to understand why some of this is being propagated, and also really make an effort to create alternative fact-based narratives. But in some case, try to understand, maybe it's not about the rumor, maybe it's about people who are angry at the system because they're not getting the services that they're being told that they should be getting, or they can't get access to them. Or so I think trying to understand better what's driving some of it. And I think we need multiple things. Get rid of as much of the negative stuff, surround it by more positive, accurate narratives, and also try to understand if there's other things going on below it.
Okay, terrific. If I could just briefly shill for our journal, the HKS Misinformation Review, we're publishing lots of papers from people doing studies on exactly that question.
Great. I look forward to
that. So I would refer the person who asked this question to have a look at the website. Anyway, let me move on to the next question. You have a US states map similar to the global map showing opinion change from 2015 to 2018.
Yes. Actually it's different, but there is a US map, by the way, in the paper, I think that was sent around on the New England Journal of Vaccine Hesitant Moment. That's actually down to postal code. It doesn't show change, but it does show the spread. We have the data. We haven't disaggregated it to do the change, but we have the location of all of our US data. So I don't have the map of the change, but we have the data to create the map.
Okay. The next question. About the listening project, you mentioned crises in general. Are there any in particular that the group is focusing on?
Mentioned what in general?
Let's see, you mentioned crises in general. Are there any in particular that your group is focusing on? The listening project group.
Yeah, well, we're rather than just making it pandemic, I think the main things are severe weather, kind of climate related issues, food security, and disease, but also any risk of other kinds of attacks, the kinds of things where building local community resilience is going to be important. Who do you turn to? How do you get organized? How do you, and what do you need? In terms of issues, that's one of the reasons we're doing all this listening now. But from our preliminary listening, we're hearing youth mental health. We're hearing trust, and so we have a special part that's looking at trust and technology, and genders come up in different ways. But we're just at the beginning. If anyone's interested, actually, in working with us, or if you're looking for a project for university or whatever, or just if you're interested, contact me, because we have a lot of data.
Okay. Actually, the next question was one that I was wondering about for your presentation. Why is the anti-vax sentiment so strong in France?
Yeah, that one, to be honest, as I said, I thought the US was kind of win the prize, but I have to say, if you disaggregate the US by state, you might have a map a bit closer to Europe. Although overall it kind of adds up higher in Europe. Well, in France, it's a history of issues. One, it's a quite litigious society, a lot of questioning, and there were a whole series of things that happened between a tainted blood supply that wasn't uh, reported until later. I mean, HIV tainted. There was another issue with a scare around a hepatitis B vaccine that turned out not to be related to multiple sclerosis, which was the rumor. But because the Minister of Health stopped the program in the school as a precautionary measure, people thought, aha, of course there's a problem. And then there were issues with HPV, and then with H1N1 pandemic, there was outrage that the government, ordered all these vaccines for something that wasn't that big. It was just a sequence, and it wasn't just about vaccine things, but it's a very, yeah, it's a fighting country. And we had the French Revolution, you got, yeah. Anyway, there's a history there, but there's also some specific incidents that have contributed to it.
Okay. Can you share more on the objectives and deliverables from the Global Listening Project? What are you hoping to accomplish with it?
Well, the first thing we're going to do in this first year of it, we'll be producing a report that will be launched in mid-2023, which is really, if nothing else, we'll have a historic capturing of basically a lot of interviews, focus groups. We're going to generate an index that we're then going to run more globally based on the key things that have come up in our formative research across these different settings. Based on that, we'll be convening different roundtables on issues that emerge that are expressed by people. I also want to really work together with, there's a lot of pandemic preparedness activities, but I honestly haven't seen any that really look in any deep way on societal preparedness. It's about systems, it's about supplies, it's about surveillance, it's about human resources, but there's nothing in these preparedness plans on really preparing society and on how to manage these things or prepare for it. And so we want to be informing that. And then we'll be using the index to monitor it over time. And where we see local issues, we're going to be working on co-creating interventions and trialing, piloting different types of interventions to build local resilience. That's the longer term vision, but the immediate thing is to do a global mapping and have that accessible. And then we're building out the website to have we'll have more and more reports from the field as we have our global network sending material in.
Okay, next question. So societal cohesion may be one solution to misinformation, and yet social media is one of the drivers of the problem. Regulating Facebook is therefore not part of the answer, or I guess the question is, regulating Facebook not therefore part of the answer? A Harvard-educated friend told me, well, the CDC changes its recommendations all the time. Can I guess just asking for your thoughts.
I certainly think it's part of the solution, but it's not the only one. I guess that's your question kind of answered. It's part of the solution. I think we have to do as much as we can from all sides. I personally think where we really need to try to push some change in Facebook and some of the other amplifying factors is in the algorithms. I think we have to nip it off on the back end in terms of the pace and the breadth of spread, because it's just moving so quickly and so fast that I think if there are pieces that they don't feel like they can take down because it's too ambiguous, but it's clearly undermining a health intervention, can they at least rein it in terms of the scope and spread? So I think the nature of what we're asking them to do, we need to think, where can we get the most impact?
Okay. Next question. Is it only in the US that you find significant threats of violence against advocates of vaccine most prevalent? Or does it exist across the globe?
What was the question?
Yeah, I know, I kind of jarbled that. Is it only in the US that you find significant threats and violence against advocates of vaccines? Is this most prevalent in the US, or are you finding it similarly worldwide? Threats of violence against vaccines?
It's definitely worldwide. I think one of the slides I was showing a few different countries, but it's certainly in Europe. I'm based in Brussels, and I mean, we've had scientists here that had to be taken to kind of hidden houses in the Netherlands, some security around their house. I know in Germany, in different countries, also in other countries in the world, Iran. There have been a number of countries where scientists have really been aggressed, and healthcare professionals. Yeah, it's unfortunately a global phenomenon.
So I guess we have a couple minutes left, and I actually would like to ask a question because, we've had vaccine mandates for many years, all sorts of vaccine mandates, and we've had some sort of populist reactions against them. We had an anti-vax movement, but it seems to be far more robust here. And I'm wondering, what do you think is different? Do you have a sort of a sense of why this time it's been so much more, at least loud, if not more widespread?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the and I'm not a big fan of mandates. I think it's better if people can come of their own voluntarily. But in situations like schools, school requirements for vaccination, workplace requirements for vaccination, in those cases, you're getting the vaccine to protect others. And I did a lot in the UN on the whole child rights and human rights. And one of the first things you really learn is you have your rights until they harm others, and where the rights become responsibilities. And mandates are not for you as an individual. In general, it's for settings and to mitigate the spread, to mitigate contagion. So I think that when it gets kind of in the system in a way that's just part of a process, I think the thing that's taken it, and of course, as we know, it's not accepted everywhere. Some people homeschool just to keep their kids from having to get a vaccine. There are ways around it, but I think the escalation was particularly escalated during COVID because we were in a pressure cooker. And it was this feeling of control on all sides, control on where you go, control on your movement, control on, your mask, not just it was way beyond vaccines. It was this overall environment of feeling controlled. And I think that really kind of tipped the balance of people's threshold for, that they'll people in general can be pretty understanding and cooperative. Evolutionarily, we have, but I think it's just, and we will recover from this one. But I think what the challenge is that just in the scientific community, there's a kind of acute awareness that the pace of these different, both infectious disease outbreaks and things like extreme weather, and its implications for food and water, and all these things are external pressures that we're going to have to learn to cope with. And it does. The good side is that it pushes innovation. It's, people, I think, I'd like to think we come out of this better, at least, and get more innovative and creative with how we do things and less waste. So. Gotta
Okay.
take a hopeful
Sorry.
spin. Yes.
Sorry. So we've hit or actually passed the 1 o'clock hour by a couple of minutes. So unfortunately, we're going to have to stop there. But I want to thank Professor Heidi Larson one more time. Virtual applause doesn't work very well, especially at a webinar. But thank you so much for your time and for your presentation.
Thanks so much. It's good to meet you.
Bye, everybody.
Okay. Bye.